Okay, so this video is about the specification points involved with the nutrient cycles. So it's specification point 3.5.4, as you can see, and there are two cycles that you need to learn about, the nitrogen cycle and the phosphorus cycle. And as part of the cycles, you also need to know about the roles microorganisms play. And these include things like saprobionts, something called mycorrhizae, and also bacteria. And there are lots of different processes that these microorganisms help to facilitate as part of these cycles. Now, if you just read the specification points, and you'll see in brackets, it says the names of individual species of bacteria are not required. Okay, but we're actually going to give you the names of those bacteria. Just you'll never be asked specifically to name them in exam questions, but we do know that some exam questions do use their names. And obviously, when you're looking at different revision guides and textbooks and different sources of revision material, you'll probably see them named their term. And it's not going to help, it's not going to not help you if you want to go on to university and study biology at a higher level. It's only going to make things easier for you in the next step if you know a little bit more information now. So a bit of extension material there. Okay. You also need to know about the use of natural and artificial fertilizers, and also the environmental issues of using things like that as well as part of these cycles. Now, at GCSE, you've looked at nutrient cycles there too already, and specifically the carbon cycle was something that you looked at. So if you look in the study guide, and here now we've got the carbon cycle, this is literally just for revision. Okay, so just to remind you how a cycle is presented, how it's drawn, different arrows and what they mean, things like that. So if you look here, we've got the carbon cycle, and what I'd like you to do, just for a bit of revision, is if you pause the video now, and when you pause the video, have a think about what you think each of these arrows represents, okay? And what I've done is I've color coordinated the arrows. So you'll see, for instance, there are 3 red arrows, and that's because those 3 arrows are representing the exact same process each time. Okay, and then there's 2 purple ones, for instance, and 1 of each of the other colours. So just like I say, for a bit of revision, you might not remember all of them, but see if you can pause the video and make a note of what process you think is represented by each of the different coloured arrows. And when you press play again, we'll have a look at the answers. Okay, so hopefully you've come up with something like this. As it's a cycle, it doesn't really matter where you start talking about it, but I always tend to start this particular cycle with the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Okay, so like I say, with these nutrient cycles, what we're doing is we're following the journey of a particular type of atom. So in this cycle, we're following the carbon atoms. So as you can see here, in the atmosphere, those carbon atoms are forming part of the carbon dioxide molecule in the air, which is obviously a gas. And that carbon within the carbon dioxide can be transferred. If you look at the left-hand side of the diagram, can be transferred to producers as part of the process of photosynthesis. So the blue arrow there is representing photosynthesis, which of course you should know is carbon dioxide plus water being used to make glucose and oxygen. And producers are therefore our photosynthesizing plants. Now, our photosynthesizing plants also respire. So as you can see here, we've got the red arrows representing respiration, which is the opposite of photosynthesis. All living organisms respire, and that then is the conversion of the glucose and the oxygen back into carbon dioxide and water. So as a producer, they can take in carbon dioxide through diffusion from the atmosphere, and they can also release that carbon dioxide that they then produce in respiration back. So you have a little mini cycle just there already. Okay. Now, the carbon that the producers take in through the carbon dioxide, like I say, is going to be used in photosynthesis. It's going to be used to create glucose molecules. So those carbon atoms present in the carbon dioxide become part of the glucose molecule. And then, of course, you have consumers, which are animals, which are going to then eat the producers, and we have transfer of those carbon atoms into them. Okay, so you can see that's represented by the brown arrow there, and it's representing actually 3 different processes. So first we have feeding. So that's where we actually physically eat and take in whatever molecule or organism we're eating. We then have digestion. So again, if you want to pause the video and see if you remember the definition of digestion. Okay, so hopefully you'll remember from your year 1 studies that digestion is the conversion of our large insoluble molecules into smaller soluble molecules that can be absorbed. So for example here, a consumer eating a producer is going to take in the large insoluble molecule of starch. And of course, starch is being large, can't pass across plasma membranes very easily. So it needs to be digested. So within a digestive system, we have 2 enzymes. We have amylase and maltase, and they would be responsible for hydrolyzing the glycosidic bonds between the glucose molecules in the starch and releasing individual glucose molecules. And those individual glucose molecules, because they're much smaller and soluble, are more easily transported, and they can pass across plasma membranes through, if you remember, through carrier proteins. So once they're then inside of the cells of the consumer, they can then be used to make the consumer's molecules. So for instance, glycogen within an animal. And that's what assimilation is. So that's the opposite of digestion, where you start with small soluble molecules and join them together through condensation to make a larger molecule again. Okay. So again, like I say, that's showing the transfer of the carbon atoms from the producers to the consumers. And of course, consumers are alive and therefore respire, and they can then release that carbon dioxide from respiration back into the atmosphere, the same as the producers. Now, if we stick with the producers and the consumers, can you see the 2 purple arrows there? So this is representing death, waste and leaf fall. Obviously, the leaf fall would only be from producers that have leaves that fall in autumn. But yeah, so the producers and consumers can die. They also produce waste. So for instance, consumers through their urine and their feces, and like I say, the leaf fall from the trees and other plants that leaves fall from. All of that ends up as dead organic matter. Okay. And organic, if you remember from our biological molecules topic in year 1, is anything that contains carbon, hydrogen and oxygen atoms. So all 3 need to be present for a molecule to be classed as organic. So the death, waste and leaf fall produces dead organic matter, which then ends up, can you see at the bottom there, as something called detritus. Now, detritus is what you would understand as soil. So it's the nutrient-rich soil that is then formed on the ground. Okay? And like I say, it contains carbon atoms because a lot of the material comes from the producers and consumers and is the organic matter that is derived from them. So there will be carbon atoms present within that. So then you have organisms that are responsible for decomposition. So organisms can either be classed as decomposers or detritivores. So if you're a decomposer, you're probably a bacteria or a fungi. If you're a detritivore, well, then you're probably something like an earthworm or a woodlouse. Either way, you feed off dead organic matter. And what you do is you use enzymes. Again, normally it's extracellularly. So the enzymes would be released out of the body, and that digestion would happen outside of the body. And then all of those small soluble molecules can be absorbed. So the products of digestion can be absorbed directly into the decomposers or detritivores' bodies for then use in assimilation inside of theirs. So decomposition is the transfer of carbon atoms, this time from the dead organic matter into the decomposers. And again, decomposers are alive. They're going to be respiring and releasing carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. So we have the transfer of carbon atoms back there again. Now, that's obviously the biology side of it, but you also will have learned at GCSE about fossilization. So our dead producers and consumers can be fossilized. So we have the transfer of carbon atoms into fossil fuels, which can then be burnt through combustion, again releasing carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere, and the cycle continues. Okay, so the important thing to remember here is that the arrows are showing the transfer of those carbon atoms. Okay? In the same way, we'll look at the nitrogen cycle. So again, we're tracing the journey of nitrogen atoms. So, sorry, I should have reminded you why this is so important. So in the carbon cycle, obviously carbon is part of every single organic molecule. So in year one, you study carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, nucleic acids. All of these contain carbon. So without carbon atoms, you wouldn't be able to make any of those molecules. Likewise, nitrogen atoms are found, if you remember, in proteins and nucleic acids. So again, really, really important, because if you can't make proteins, you can't make enzymes. And if you can't make nucleotides, well, then you can't make DNA or RNA. And obviously life wouldn't exist. Okay, so it's really important that we have this recycling of these atoms so that new organisms can make the molecules that they need for life. Okay, so the nitrogen cycle isn't really something that you've studied in such detail before. But again, if we start at the top of the diagram, you'll see that nitrogen atoms exist as nitrogen gas in the air as the molecule N2. So two nitrogen atoms joined together. And if anybody remembers their chemistry, you'll know that those two atoms are joined together by a triple covalent bond, which is really, really, really strong. And because of that, nitrogen gas and those nitrogen atoms within that molecule, they're not biologically useful. We don't really have anything in biology that's capable of breaking that triple bond and releasing those nitrogen atoms. Okay, so the nitrogen cycle is really, really important to break that triple bond, to release those initial carbon atoms so that they can enter the cycle in the first place and so that they can be used. Okay, so 3 things that you need to be able to do here. You need to be able to name the process that an arrow is representing. You need to be able to talk about the microorganisms that facilitate that process happening, and then obviously describe the process and what's occurring. Okay, so you'll see the first process that we're going to talk about is nitrogen fixation. And this is the conversion, well, not the conversion, but the transfer of the nitrogen atoms from that nitrogen molecule in the air into either ammonium ions or nitrate ions. You can see there's 2 arrows coming from the nitrogen gas in the air. Okay? So the first way happens purely by chance when there is a lightning storm. So you know what lightning is, and lightning is very, very, very high energy. So if there's lightning around in the atmosphere, there is enough energy within that lightning to break the triple bond between the 2 nitrogen atoms. And then what happens is the nitrogen combines with oxygen from water vapor that's in the atmosphere as well, which is why it ends up as nitrate ions, which, as you can see there, are NO3-. So that's where the oxygen comes from, the water vapor in the atmosphere. But you don't need to worry about that. So all you need to remember is we have nitrogen fixation, which is the breaking of the triple bond between the 2 nitrogen atoms by the energy in lightning. Okay, now, of course, we don't have lightning all the time. So instead, this can happen via an alternative route, which is more likely to happen. Okay? And this is where our microorganisms come into it. So we have some bacteria that are called nitrogen fixing bacteria. And there are 2 different types of nitrogen fixing bacteria. So you can see there, one's called Azotobacter, and that lives in the soil by itself. And there's also a second nitrogen fixing bacteria called Rhizobium. And that lives in roots of certain types of plants. Okay, sometimes you'll see roots look like they've got little knobbly knees, and that's called a root nodule. And it's a little cluster of these Rhizobium bacteria. Okay. Now, both Azotobacter and Rhizobium contain an enzyme, or two enzymes actually, called nitrogenase and nitrogen reductase. Okay. Now, it's actually the enzymes that can convert the nitrogen gas into ammonium ions. So N2, the nitrogen molecule, is the substrate for those two enzymes, and ammonium ions are the product. Now, like I say, in your specification, it says that you don't need to know the names of the bacteria. All you need to know is that they are nitrogen fixing bacteria, and some live in the soil and some live in roots. That's all you need to remember. Okay? But that then converts our nitrogen atoms from our nitrogen molecule as a gas in the air into ammonium ions, which are now in the soil. Okay? Now, these ammonium ions are a biologically useful form of nitrogen atoms. So whereas an organism, you wouldn't be able to use the nitrogen from the nitrogen molecules in the air as a gas because of that triple bond not being able to be broken, it's now in a form where we can utilize it. Okay. Now, there are another two types of bacteria. So again, the names Nitrosomonas and Nitrobacter, but collectively they're known as nitrifying bacteria, responsible for the process of nitrification. So again, you don't need to know the names, but you do need to know that they carry out this two-step process of nitrification. So they convert ammonium ions into nitrite ions, and then nitrite into nitrate ions. And all of this would happen in the soil. Now, you can see there that this requires aerobic conditions, whereas nitrogen fixation required anaerobic. Now, we'll come back to that when we look at the human impact on the nitrogen cycle. Okay, but from our ammonium ions now, we've created nitrate ions, and these are the most important ions. Okay, so you want to make sure within any ecosystem that it's the nitrate ions that you're creating and promoting the production of. Now, unfortunately, there's this process called denitrification, which, if the conditions are anaerobic, can convert our nitrate ions back into nitrogen gas as N2 back into the atmosphere. So you have this little cycle cycling around up there, but this isn't something that we want to promote. Okay, so denitrification, again, it occurs from a bacteria called denitrifying bacteria. Proper name, Pseudomonas denitrificans, which you don't need to know. Like I say, just call it denitrifying bacteria. This isn't something we want to happen. We'll come back to that later. What we do want to happen is for these nitrate ions to be absorbed by our plants. So they're normally absorbed by diffusion, but once the concentration is low outside compared to inside the roots of the plants, active transport will take over. And there's another microorganism here called mycorrhizae, which helps plants to absorb those nitrates more efficiently. Okay? So once we have the nitrates absorbed by the plants then can utilize the nitrogen atoms there within the nitrate ion to make proteins, but also to make nucleic acids like DNA and RNA. So it's not just the proteins, but it would be more proteins than anything else. Okay? And then, of course, like the carbon cycle, we've got animals which are going to feed on the plants. Digestion and assimilation are going to occur in the same ways we discussed earlier. So all of the carbohydrates, it says carbohydrates, I don't know why I'm talking about carbohydrates there, but the proteins present within the plants, the nitrogen within them are going to be transferred to the animals and then incorporated into the animal proteins. Now, to complete the cycle, again, like with the carbon cycle, we have decomposers which are going to feed off the dead organic matter, but in this case, the dead organic matter that contains the nitrogen atoms, and a process called, well, either decomposition or ammonification. And the organisms that carry out this step are, as I said before, the decomposers or detritivores. We can also, at this level, call them saprobionts. So these are the organisms that feed off the dead organic matter. So they would then take in the nitrogen atoms from the plant and the animals, from their proteins and DNA and RNA, and then they convert them back into ammonium ions. And that completes our journey of the nitrogen atoms through the nitrogen cycle.